When I was on vacation last month in Orlando, I met up with Father Blake Britton, who I had interviewed on the Corpus Christi show about video games. And during dinner with Father Blake, I asked him to share about his upbringing in Florida. He shared this great story. His dad, believe it or not, Father Blake's dad used to be a black ops agent, like legit U.S. military, Secret Service, black ops kind of stuff. Cool fact of the day, Father Blake's dad, his body is a registered weapon. His body is actually a registered weapon. I thought that was just like Chuck Norris stuff, but it's actually real. Your body can be a registered weapon. And so, of course, growing up, Father Blake's dad taught his boys how to use their bodies to defend themselves. Never to get in a fight, but in case someone attacked them, he taught his boys really well how to defend themselves. For example, he said instead of using fists, he taught them how to use elbows. But Father Blake said he was a really kind, nice little boy growing up, never got in a single fight until one day in grade 7. The class bully decided that Father Blake was his next victim. And so during recess, Father Blake remembers the class bully walking up behind him. "Hey, Blake." And he poured a carton of chocolate milk over his head, embarrassing him in front of the whole class and hoping to start a fight. In that instant, Father Blake said his black ops training was just triggered and bam, threw him an elbow. Without providing too much detail, he provided a lot of detail to me. I won't provide to you. Let's just say the elbow worked really, really well. And so the bully was rushed to the nurse's office, and Father Blake was sent to the principal's office. His mom came, of course, picked him up. "I can't believe this," she said, crying. "I did not raise my son to be like his father." And then she's driving Blake home, and she says these terrifying words to him. "Wait till your father gets home. He's going to deal with you." So Blake anxiously waits for his dad. His dad comes home. The mom tells the father what the son has done. And the father, the ex-Black Ops agent, goes to Blake and points to the dark forest area in their backyard. So Blake remembers he's feeling like the prodigal son. He's got his head down, covered in shame, guilt, thinking up his best excuse that he's going to give to his dad so that he won't get killed. And after a couple of the longest minutes of his life, he hears, "Attention." And Blake stands up, best military posture. "Yes, sir." "I heard you got in a fight today. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir." "Did you use the elbows like I taught you?" "Yes, Daddy, I did. And it worked really well." "That's my boy. Now your mama thinks I'm gonna give you a whooping. So when you go back there, you gotta be holding your behind, crying. You understand me?" "Yes, Daddy." So Father Blake goes back into the home, holding his behind, crying. And the mom goes to console the dad, and she says, "I know it's hard, you did the right thing." And then Father Blake just turns around to look at his dad, and his dad has this huge grin on his face and gives him a thumbs up. And Father Blake and his dad never told that story to a single person, not even the mother, until he was ordained a priest. And during his reception dinner, he told everyone, so Father Blake said I could share the story with anyone I wanted. Today's gospel, we have the parable of the prodigal son. And we can often just focus entirely on the son, on his disobedience, his sinful life, rebellion, and eventual conversion. Indeed, we call it the parable of the prodigal son. But the big story, the main event, the real reason why Jesus even shared this parable is for us to focus on the Father. That's the whole reason Jesus is sharing the parable. Not for us to think about some rebellious son who comes back, but to focus on the Father. Because the Father is the image of God. Jesus is revealing to us what God the Father is like. If Jesus had to name the parable, I'm sure he would have called it the parable of the prodigal father. For in this parable, we see a father who is truly prodigal. He's extravagant, he's lavish, he's abundant in the love that he shares with his sons. So I want to set up these two extremes for us today. On the one hand, we have the parable of the prodigal son. On the other hand, we have the parable of the prodigal father. Okay, the parable of the prodigal son. Father Blake's the image for that. Just picture him walking out to the dark forest area in his backyard, his head's down, covered in guilt and shame, trying to think up his best excuse so he's not going to get killed. Because this is what people were expecting when they heard the parable. Death. That's what the older brother thought, and that's what everyone who heard Jesus share this parable for the first time thought. Death. It's true. In Jesus' time, if a Jewish son lost his inheritance among the Gentiles, when he returned home, as what happened exactly in the parable, the community would gather together and perform a ceremony called the kezazah. Say that with me. Kezazah. Kezazah. Okay. In this ceremony, the kezazah, what would happen is the father would take a large pot, and smash it in front of the son and say, "You are now cut off from your people." The broken pot was an image of the broken relationship. And then, if the father felt like it, he could actually kill the son. That was actually allowed. Honor killing was allowed at the time of Jesus. So that's what the prodigal son thought. That's what the older brother thought would happen. That's what people listening to the parable thought would happen. Death. But the father was having a good day, spared the son, gave him another chance. That's the parable of the prodigal son. But on the other hand, we have the parable of the prodigal father. What does the father do? We first see that he goes out and runs. For us, that seems normal. But back then, that was total embarrassment. Because the elderly men wore these great tunics. Think of like the garments that I'm wearing here. And for them to run, they had to pull up their tunics, and that would expose their legs. And to expose your legs was total shame and embarrassment back then. So no elderly man ran. So that's the first warning sign. That's the first trigger that something crazy is happening here. That the father ran to meet the son. Obviously, the father couldn't hold himself in. He couldn't wait. He couldn't wait to share what he had for the son, which was clearly overflowing love and joy for his son. And he proved it. We see a huge list of amazing things like the best robe, sandals, ring, throws the greatest party known to man. That's the image. And just as Father Blake's dad, think back about what he did. He couldn't contain the joy that he had for his son. He tried to hold it in, but he just said to his son, "That's my boy." I imagine the father doing the same thing to the prodigal son when he returns. "That's my boy." And then bringing him back into the home and in front of all the community who expected the kezazah ceremony. They expected shame and death. The father pointing to everyone with a great smile, "That's my boy." So we have these two extremes, two parables. The parable of the prodigal son and the parable of the prodigal father. So a question for you and for me, real question. What parable are you living out? in your relationship with God? What parable are you living out in your relationship with God? Are you living the parable of the prodigal son? Or are you living the parable of the prodigal father? Okay, the parable of the prodigal son. This is the image of Father Blake and the sons in the parable, focusing entirely upon sin, hoping not to get punished by God, avoiding God, wanting just to start over, hoping God doesn't have a bad day. Could that be the image you might have of God? Or are you living out the parable of the prodigal father in your relationship with God? Do you see God behave like Father Blake's dad or like the father in this parable? Do you focus on God as a father who just can't wait to share his joy and love with you? That he is overflowing with affection for you? And if so, you just want to be with him. So which parable are you living out when you think about God and your relationship with him? To go deeper, to answer this question, we can look at how we approach the sacrament of reconciliation. Okay, when I go to confession, am I living out the parable of the prodigal son, or am I living the parable of the prodigal father? Do we feel like it's the parable of the prodigal son? Do I just focus on myself, my guilt, my sin, my shame? Do I feel like Father Blake walking out to a dark forest, head down, covered in shame, thinking up excuses, hoping God's not having a bad day, hoping the priest is not having a bad day, hoping they'll just get rid of my guilt and shame and just start again? That's the parable of the prodigal son. Or when I go to confession, am I living out the parable of the prodigal father? Do I focus on what God is like? Do I focus on what God is thinking about me? On the joy that he has for me going to confession? Do I picture God the Father with a big grin, eager for me to go to confession, desiring to reconcile with me, to share his joy with me? Because that's what happens in confession. Jesus said, "There's more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 persons who have no need of repentance." That's what happens in confession. God the Father is literally throwing a party for you in heaven. He has a grin on his face saying, "That's my boy. That's my girl." He can't wait for you to be reconciled with him. And when the priest says the words of absolution, think about it. It's all about God the Father, through the death and resurrection of his Son, has reconciled the world to himself. You can enter your name in there. God the Father, through the death and resurrection of his Son, has reconciled Seamus O'Brien to himself, has reconciled, enter your name in there, to himself. That's what God the Father is doing the work. And it's a work of joy that he can't wait to reconcile you with himself. So today is called Laetare Sunday, a Latin word for rejoice. And if there's one place in the whole wide world where there is an event of joy, where God the Father is excited, it's in the confessional. So often we just focus on ourselves, myself included. Just focus on myself, getting rid of my guilt, my shame, starting over again. But confession is far more about God, about his heart towards you, about his joy, the affection that he wants to share with you. So if you want to bring someone joy this Lent, go to confession.